If you have ever finished a book and been plunged into a kind of emotionless cloud of unreality, then you will understand how I felt when I finished these three books. And two of them were in the past couple of weeks, so honestly, it's been quite a month. Now, these are not just books that I enjoyed, these are books that transformed me, that left me permanently changed and altered my perspective on the world as I know it. Now, the first book here that I want to talk about is actually the one that I read most recently, and that's because it's really fresh in my mind. This book I can't stop thinking about. Every Man Dies Alone by Hans Fallada. This is far and away the best book that I have read this entire year. And honestly, it's one of the best books I've ever read in my entire life, and I do not say that lightly. There are very few books, you can watch my previous videos that I've mentioned this about. This is one of those rare books that leaves you both heartbroken and also deeply grateful that you read it at the same time. Now, the setting is in Nazi Germany, and it follows an ordinary kind of working class couple named Otto and Anna, and their son has died in the war. And the premise of the novel is that in response to this, they begin this small and quiet act of resistance where they write postcards criticizing their Fuhrer and the Nazi regime. And they leave these cards all around Berlin and eventually even beyond Berlin. And that's kind of the plot in its simplest form. There are other characters and other moving angles, and they all add so much richness. But what this book is really about is fear and courage and moral resistance and the dignity of doing the right thing, even when the outcomes are almost hopeless. It's almost impossible to make a positive change, to effectuate even a modicum of positive change. And what makes it so powerful is that this is also based on a true story. Fallada wrote this novel over 24 days in 1946, after having lived through the Nazi regime in Germany. And his own relationship during that period was deeply complicated, right? Because he remained in Germany, so he had to make compromises. He later seems to understand some of those compromises as a moral failure, right? Like even a character that he wrote kind of positively about an SA man or something. But that makes it even more unsettling because there isn't this clean moral distinction, like a lecturer of like someone who was completely untouched by the corrupting regime in the world that he's describing. Like, he made moral compromises and he's still writing this book. And it feels like a book written by someone who understood that fear from the inside, but also the potential of small acts of defiance and resistance, which Fallada also did. And that's part of why it works so well. This book doesn't present courage as something that's glamorous and there's no big speeches, there's no war fights, or the war is way in the background, way in the distance. It doesn't affect us. There's no easy heroism or swelling music, right? There are just ordinary people that are trying to act morally in a world that is specifically designed to crush morality. There's also a police commissioner, investigator character, and this kind of like thief. They're all so great. And that's, I think, what broke me is when I read this book, the resistance is so small. It's painfully small. A postcard, a sentence here, their refusal to do something. Different characters pay for it with their lives. The decision not to surrender their conscience. And yet, in this world, which is ruled by terror, those small acts become enormous. Now, Primo Levi reportedly called this the greatest book ever written about German resistance, and I actually think I understand. I agree with him on this. Not that I've read every single book in that genre, but the novel really understands totalitarianism, not just through work and violence, but through fear, right? Through suspicion, through convincing ordinary people to kind of that their survival requires them to be silent or them to go along with everything that's happening. And against that, Fallada places these tiny acts of defiance. It's a great complementary one to read alongside like 1984 if you want to look at the Soviet side of things to see the Nazi side. But this book reminded me of the importance of doing the right thing regardless of the outcome. And the famous verse from the Gita came to my mind that you have the right to work, but never to the fruit of work. And that's really something that Otto and Anna both understood. And man, it's just heartbreaking reading this novel, but I kept thinking about that while I was reading this. Because so much of modern life, I think, teaches us to evaluate action based on the results. And sometimes that's valuable. Did it work? Did it scale? Did it win? Did it change anything? Did it make any effect for the change, for the positive? But in Every Man Dies Alone, it's completely different questions being asked. It's, what if it doesn't make a difference? What's the moral worth of that action? How is it measured when it doesn't succeed? And honestly, it's something that I'm going to be thinking about for the rest of my life. What are the things worth doing because they're right, even if they have no change or no effect on the world? And yeah, I'll just say this. I've already said it, but this book shook me. It's devastating. It's difficult. Not a light read at all, but I think an essential read. I highly recommend Every Man Dies Alone by Hans Fallada. Now, the second book is another one that you're probably familiar with, Stoner by John Williams. Now, I finished reading this one a few weeks ago on a sunny day, and afterward I lay down in the grass and just stared up at the sky for a long time, which is not my usual review process, by the way, in case you were wondering. But it felt necessary in this case. And the reason is because Stoner, it tells the story of William Stoner, who is basically his whole life story. He goes from this farming family to study agriculture, then he goes to university and discovers literature and decides he wants to become a professor. He marries, but unhappily, and has a career, and there's ups and downs, but it's mostly difficult, and he lives with, kind of from the outside, what looks like a pretty uneventful, boring, unsuccessful life. But the strange genius of this book is that even though it sounds like nothing really consequential happens, at the end of this, you're left feeling like so much has happened. Like you just can't express in words what you just experienced. And that's by design. Williams is a genius. Now, I read John Williams' other famous work, Butcher's Crossing, last year, and that remains my favorite book by him personally for very different reasons, but Stoner is extraordinary in a completely different way. What it struck me most about this book, for myself personally, is William Stoner's love of literature. Because for him, literature becomes this kind of guiding force through his life, and it gives him this purpose and this dignity, and it gives him something real in the world that is kind of filling up around him with all of these unreal, stupid things, office politics and ambition and bitterness and vanity, and people who just are motivated by everything except the actual love of the thing itself. And William Stoner isn't like that. Maybe he's too innocent for the world, but it really struck a chord with me because I don't know how to put it. Like, yeah, I guess in some ways he's just too innocent, and he's just different in the way he thinks than the world. Not innocent in the sense that he's like perfect or anything. He's flawed character. He's passive a lot of times when we want him to act. He fails in many painful ways, and you want him to act. You want him to do something, and he just doesn't, right? But there's something in him that remains really devoted to that life of the mind, to that life of meaning through literature and in academia and teaching and the kind of private integrity. And I think that's partly what really moved me in this. Possibly I also saw a concerning amount of myself in William Stoner, and that feeling of retreating into books, desire for meaning, fear of being swallowed by these big institutions and systems and relationships that don't really understand you and all of that side of stuff. I think that sense that life can pass by quietly, and by the time you understand what really mattered to you, a lot of stuff is gone, a lot of time is gone, is something that Stoner is going through. And at least for myself, I can relate to some of that, right? The book's about lost time and unfulfilled relationships and disappointment. And somehow, given all of this, it doesn't sound like I'm pitching a really good novel, but it is not just a bleak novel, because William Stoner finds meaning in these seemingly small, ordinary things, and perhaps that is really the extraordinary side of this. Perhaps his life is really extraordinary rather than ordinary, specifically because it doesn't have fanfare, because there are no great public transformations or heroic final acts or something. It's just a real human, trying and failing and sometimes succeeding and loving and teaching and occasionally glimpsing beauty throughout it all. And I think that's why this book stays with you. It makes you look differently at everyday moments. And that's something that I think we can get more of in literature. Because we live everyday moments. We don't live these great, grand, heroic arcs all of the time, although those are great too. But it makes you ask whether the ordinary life you are living is actually a lot deeper than you really realize on the surface. It reminded me to look for meaning not just in these dramatic moments, but in the daily ones. So the books we return to, right? The work we do, the people we love and the people we fail, and the little loyalties and everything that defines our life, the moments that define our life. So that's the second one. I don't know if I can compare Stoner to Every Man Dies Alone because they're completely different books and they will resonate totally differently with you depending on who you are and what stage of life you are in, and specifically like if something's happened in your life around that time. But both of these books really impacted me. They left me stunned. And I think reading them at different stages, I could see how they're just so resonant, these books. They're so much larger than any one individual. And both of them reminded me that literature does not need spectacle to be transformative, which is what I love about it. Now, the third book here is A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. This is one I read a while ago, but when I was thinking about making this video, I thought this one really belongs in this category for a different reason, though. This novel is about Afghanistan, war, family, suffering, friendship. Motherhood's a big theme in it as well, and endurance through oppression. And it follows two women whose lives are kind of bound together in these really difficult, brutal circumstances in Afghanistan. And it's one of those books that is very emotionally overwhelming, not subtly like these other books, but extremely directly. Maybe more like Every Man Dies Alone and Stoner, you're kind of devastated more quietly, but Thousand Splendid Suns, you see you're devastated by this open depiction of suffering. And it's not subtle about the suffering, right? And that's obviously not a criticism. It's not like it's garish or anything, but the suffering is not subtle because sometimes history isn't subtle, and sometimes cruelty isn't subtle, and sometimes really bad things happen in this world. And I think what Hosseini does really well is he makes the reader feel human, the human cost of political and domestic violence, the human cost of all of these big political actions on intimate characters. And it's not just about, obviously, the historical events and, what the events do to individuals. It's a story about what those events do to homes, to relationships like marriage, to relationships like mother and child, or to feelings like hope. And what makes this book so powerful is that it not only is a book about suffering, although that's a big theme there, it's also about love, and not like the kind of love you're thinking of, right? It's about the love between friends, the love that survives in places where it should be destroyed, the relationships built under pressure. It's really about the strange and terrible beauty of people protecting one another in a world that doesn't protect them at all. And I remember finishing this for the first time when I was in high school and feeling really just speechless. And emotionally, this one landed with such force for me that when I read Stoner and when I read Every Man Dies Alone, they reminded me of that initial sensation that I had. And all of this reminds me that literature can, it can take lives that might otherwise kind of be far away from us, remain in the distance, impossible to ignore, right? It brings them close to us. It can make real suffering so visceral that we can no longer ignore it. And I think that's one of the reasons I read for myself, to have that moral imagination enlarged for the better and for the worse, because we have to understand evil if we are to oppose it, of course. And so it's not only about, reading Jane Austen and seeing how the great heights of virtue, but also the great depths of depravity that are possible in the human experience. And we need to be reminded that other people's suffering is real. To be reminded that courage often appears in people, the most unexpected sources, that people that were never asked or never expected to be courageous, and yet they step up to the plate. And I think it also reminds us that love in the right hands is really a form of resistance against this evil as well. So those are the three books that genuinely shook me and changed my perspective. Every Man Dies Alone by Hans Fallada, Stoner by John Williams, A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. But I also want to mention two more books that I'm reading right now because I have a suspicion that they may end up in this same category. So the first one here is A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor, which is actually the book that we're reading right now in our book club. And I've not finished it yet, so I don't want to pretend that I know exactly what's going to happen, give it a final verdict. But so far, I am deeply drawn into it in not exactly the same way, but pretty similar. It's about a member of the Russian aristocracy who's sentenced to live under house arrest in this grand hotel in Moscow by the Bolsheviks. And what I'm loving so far is just the way it explores how much dignity one can have in such a limited circumstance. The power of beauty, in such a kind of contracted world, particularly for one who had such a wide world before, and the possibility of still making a beautiful life even when your opportunities constrict. So that's exactly the kind of book that I love reading, and the book that I love reading in community. So if you've been meaning to read A Gentleman in Moscow, I highly recommend you check it out. Of course, we'd love to have you join us, but I highly recommend that you read that one. And the other one I'm reading is A Separate Peace by John Knowles. Again, I've not finished it yet, so I don't want to say anything definitively, but it feels suspiciously like one of those books that I will not come out of the other side unchanged. Honestly, I've already been quite moved even by the part that I've read so far. So there's something about memory and youth and friendship and envy, kind of how envy can play into that, and looking back on who you once were, that already feels very close to the themes I care about deeply, kind of close to the themes I even write about or am writing about. And so I think I'll be moved by that one as well, but we will see. Maybe I will return to it in a future video and kind of like, be emotionally damaged in the best literary sense. But for now, those are the books. Every Man Dies Alone reminded me that doing the right thing matters, and even small acts of resistance matter, even when there's no guaranteed outcome. Stoner reminded me to look for meaning in the ordinary moments of life. A Thousand Splendid Suns reminded me of the endurance of love in the face of suffering. So, that to me is what great literature does. It's not a story. It's not just a story. It can be, but it gives you a window into the human experience and leaves you a little less able to lie to yourself about life, about suffering, about your experiences. It makes certain questions, harder to avoid. And yeah, sometimes you also just have to lie down in the grass and stare up at the sky for a while. So let me know in the comments and what books left you floored, left you completely transformed. What books were you unable to just go to work or just move on from immediately, that you needed to take some time, take a personal day for? What book changed the way that you see life?